Everybody, welcome to the Frontline Club and thank you for coming this evening. In a moment I'll hand you over to Bridget Kendall from the BBC who will be chairing tonight's discussion. Before I do that, I just want to say thank you to the Ukraine Crisis Media Centre for their support for this evening's event, and to ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions to wait for the microphone because we're broadcasting live. So over to Bridget.
Thank you very much. My name is Bridget Kendall. I'm BBC diplomatic correspondent. Have a long interest in Russia and countries in the near vicinity of Russia. I'm delighted to be here this evening. We're going to divide the evening into two parts because we thought it'd be good to have a bit of an update as we have two guests here direct from Kyiv among the four guests on the panel with me, to just look at where the different voices on the panel think we are in this crisis, what challenges lie ahead for the new Ukrainian president, what are the chances of resolving this or not. And so we'll hear from each of them, 5 minutes each, and then that'll give you a chance to ask questions on that specifically, the current political situation where we are. And then in the second half, we'll move on to the very interesting question of the role of the media and the information war in this conflict and how it's been specific, how it's been different from other conflicts and what it feels like from the inside. And then again, hopefully there'll be time for questions to explore that in a bit more detail. So the four panelists, just to briefly remind you who they are, on my far left is Katya Gorchinskaya, who's deputy editor of Kyiv Post. She's been there since 2008, and she belongs to the group of journalists who've been investigating the documents known as YanukovychLeaks. Right by me on my left is Dmitry Linik, who's head of the London bureau of Voice of Russia. He started his career in 1973 working for the English language service of Radio Moscow. After that, he spent a while working for the BBC, initially in Moscow and then London, before moving to the Voice of Russia. On my right, also come over from Kiev, is Petro, who is director of the Mezhyhirya School of Journalism and head of their PhD program in mass communications. But he's also one of the founders of StopFake.org, which some of you probably know, a very interesting watchdog which has been set up specifically in the wake of this crisis, looking at Russian disinformation about Ukraine. And on the far right is Victor Balagade, who's editor of Kommersant in UK. He's been doing that since 2009. He also writes for New Style, which is a Russian language magazine in London, and the Ukrainian Kharkovsky Courier. So let's start with Katya. A brief overview, Katya, some thoughts on where we are at the moment.
Well, as you probably know, Ukraine is going through one of the most interesting and challenging periods in its history. We've just had another revolution, a second one in a decade, called Euromaidan, which overthrew a very corrupt and very greedy president who ran away to Russia, to our neighbors, and left behind a lavish and excessive, huge estate just north of Kiev. And excitedly enough, we fished out a number of documents that he dumped, a few thousand documents that he dumped that prove his corruption and the exciting lifestyle that he had over there. After that, when the revolution ended and we had a new government appointed, an interim government, suddenly a war broke out in the eastern parts of the country. But even before that, we had a part of the country annexed by our neighbors, the Russians. And this is what we're living with. And on this background, we've had an historical election taking place as well, a presidential election, historical in many ways, because for once, this is the first election when the Ukrainians mobilized to elect a president in the first round, just to stop the rocking of the boat that we have in eastern Ukraine and the Russian propaganda that Ukraine is a non-functional state that is not able to elect its own government and is run by the junta. It's also historical in the sense that when we started the election campaign, we had no idea what parts of the country are going to take part in this election. By that time, we knew roughly, or had an idea, that Crimea is no longer going to belong to Ukraine, if you take it from the factual point of view, because from the international diplomacy point of view, it's still a part of Ukraine. The annexation has not been recognized internationally. Also, parts of eastern Ukraine were not able to vote in the presidential election because members of the election commissions were intimidated, were kidnapped, and prevented from organizing the election in those regions. At the same time, we have a lot of insurgents running around the streets, carrying mostly Russian-made weapons. And most recently, as some of you may know, we've had Russian tanks also entering our territory. So our president comes at a really fun time, obviously, and apart from the challenges that I've already mentioned, faces an economy that was looted for decades and is really not doing very well, a potential GDP drop of 5 to 7%, and a very corrupt and very, very clumsy bureaucracy. So I think that this is a very gloomy introduction, and it certainly has not been, the past half a year has not been short of news for us, the journalists. And I guess I'll pass the floor on to other speakers so they continue.
Well, let's hear from Dmitry Linik. Dmitry, your take on where we are now in this crisis, particularly as regards Russia and Ukraine.
Well, newly elected President Poroshenko is obviously under a huge amount of pressure. He's under pressure from the east of the country that is refusing to recognize him for a president, effectively. They didn't vote. They didn't take part in the election. He's under pressure from those in the east and center of the country to step up the military operation and to bring the east of the country to heel. He's also under pressure, I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, to re-establish control over the entire country, because that is something on which IMF credits are conditioned. Some say it's because of shale gas deposits around Slavyansk, but we, of course, cannot be shallow as that. Now, President Putin is under a lot of pressure in relation to Ukraine. He's under pressure indirectly from the people in East Ukraine who are calling on Russia to intervene. And it's not only those armed rebels, armed mostly with Russian weapons, because Kalashnikovs happen to be Russian, yeah. He's also under pressure from the more patriotic strand in Russian society, which is a huge majority now in Russia. At the same time, he's under pressure from the West, from Washington, from the EU, to not interfere in the Ukraine in any way. The degree of interference or involvement is something else. Now, it's been sort of for weeks and even months, it's been assumed that the insurgency is being orchestrated by Russia. A couple of months ago already, I think, we had reports from Kyiv to the effect that a group of 20 GRU, this state intelligence unit or whatever it is, anyway, Russian special ops men were detained in Ukraine. We still haven't seen any trace of them. There have been reports of, the 3 Russian tanks photographed by NATO, allegedly. Well, even if that is the case, what is 3 tanks in comparison to 500, I think, that Ukraine has? It's a joke, isn't it? Militarily, it doesn't make any sense at all. It only makes sense in PR terms. One more interesting thing regarding Russians' involvement. On the 5th of June, Petro Poroshenko met State Secretary John Kerry. According to the New York Times, not the Voice of Russia, John Kerry asked Poroshenko to provide evidence of Russia's involvement. And that's weeks and months into when everybody was sure that Russia is, of course, behind everything bad that's going on in Ukraine. I will readily admit that there are, of course, dozens and perhaps a few hundred Russians fighting in Ukraine on the side of the rebels. That's a fact. Nobody's denying that. But just as, I don't know, there's a few hundred Brits fighting in Syria, do we accuse London of, of being behind that? Probably not. So that is the situation. Have I?
That's fine.
Yeah?
Okay.
Thanks.
Let's go on to you, Johan, for your what you'd like to elaborate. I mean, particularly the challenges facing President Poroshenko as we go forward. He's several times talked about a ceasefire. I think today there was another discussion of it. Is this something that's realistic? Do you see this happening? There have been contacts between him and President Putin.
Yeah, actually, the biggest problem for President Poroshenko is the absence of a partner for negotiations, because what Russia presents now and used to show before is absolutely unilateral policy of absolutely blatant involvement in Ukraine's internal affairs. And it's not the matter of 3 tanks or 500 tanks. It's a matter of approach to the neighboring country, where one country can come and rewrite the rules of international politics, which have been there in use for the last 50 years or more, and say, now we would be doing everything in a completely different way because we decided that. I would just give you one quote from Mr. Glaziev, who is an advisor to President Putin and who is kind of a masterminder behind all these things. He said, those Nazis were educated in the United States, he means Ukrainian government. Just because they were educated in the United States, they are Nazis. And Americans are clearly fanning a war between Russia and Europe. So it basically brings us to the wide understanding of what happened in Ukraine. It's a war not between Ukraine and Russia, it's a Russia's war with Europe and the Western world. And if you want, it's more wider civilizational war. And just Ukraine happened to be in the wrong neighborhood to find the nearest place to those who want to rewrite the rules of international politics. When one country comes to another country and grab a portion of its land, it's not how international politics work. When one country sends insurgents to another country to kill civilians and military, it's not how international politics work. Countries should negotiate between each other, and if Mr. Putin feels Russians are abused in eastern Ukraine and want to support them, the best thing to do for them would be ceasefire and starting negotiations. And that's exactly what Poroshenko was offering and was declined, because every time he's offering starting negotiations, he cannot find a partner for that. And for negotiations, you need, as for tango, 2. And we never can find the partner for that, because every time Poroshenko starts talking about that, we find another thing happening over there. When Poroshenko started to talk about negotiations, the military transportation plane with 50 Ukrainian servicemen was shot down. All of them died. And at that very moment, it was the answer to the offer of negotiations. So with whom we negotiate? It's really inhumane to shoot down at the airplane which is descended to go, and because it's obvious that everybody on board would be killed. It's absolutely inhumane. And at the same time, Russian state media start to fund all that and say, oh, Yatsenyuk, who is the prime minister, used the word inhumane. So he means Untermenschen. So he's a fascist. So again, we come here to all these games with words, with bringing all this Nazi rhetorics, and all conflict rhetorics to the negotiations between two countries. And that's not what brings us closer to understanding of what Moscow really wants. So if anyone would ask me what Putin wants in Ukraine, the answer would be to show everybody else how he can change the rules of the game. So it's not a lesson for Ukraine itself, it's a lesson for all of you to understand what the world is looking like now. And that's why the prospects for Poroshenko would depend not only on what happens in Ukraine itself, or what he's planning as a newly elected president, or what his government is planning, but it also would depend on what Moscow is planning and how hard the West would be to support Ukrainian efforts in this struggle. Because if Ukraine would be left alone, we would definitely not survive the struggle between David and Goliath. So that's my short introduction.
Victor, give us your perspective on events.
Well, I think
where you think we are.
the lady and the gentleman gave a very good background to everything that was happening in Ukraine for today. But just browsing through the news before coming here, my latest feeling, Bridget, was that at last we are getting some positive news from Ukraine, from east of Ukraine. And the fact that Mr. Poroshenko and Mr. Putin spoke over the phone last night, and the fact that there is a ceasefire in Lugansk, and the fact that some of the rebels were allowed to enter Slavyansk and take the bodies of their comrades. And the same happened in Mariupol. I mean, the Ukrainian army was allowed to carry their dead away from the front line. This sounds all positive, but this is just the first positive news we are getting. Nobody says that tomorrow news might be much worse. But talking in general about Mr. Poroshenko, I think he's still a political leader which the world has to discover. We all know that he's a very experienced businessman. We all know that he's part of the oligarch clan in Kyiv. And he was in a government. He was one of the founders, actually, of the Regents Party, the Yanukovych Party. So he knows his ways and abouts in Kyiv politics very well. And in one way, this is a positive fact that he's an experienced politician. In another way, of course, the society, I think, might feel that the Ukrainian society at the moment is seeking for something new, for fresh blood. And Poroshenko definitely doesn't represent that part of society. But at the same time, Poroshenko is the person with whom Kremlin is ready to negotiate. And this is a very positive thing, because we know how Moscow can be very emotional in their foreign policy. We have an example of Saakashvili, we have an example of Yushchenko. So the fact that Putin can talk and is willing to talk to Poroshenko, this is a positive fact. But at the same time, of course, he came at a very, as Ekaterina put very well, in a very exciting part of the Ukrainian history. Mr. Poroshenko, I think, now is facing three main challenges. The first challenge, of course, is to deal with the problems in the eastern part of the country and bring it under the control. The second challenge is the challenge with about the gas cases with Russia, trying to solve and negotiate and come up with the mutual price for the gas. And the third challenge, of course, is the Crimea, how to deal with the fact that part of the territory of the state has been annexed by the neighbor state. So, as I said, Mr. Poroshenko is the person to discover.
Just before we turn it over to the hall, just a couple of questions from me. First one to you, Victor, is that the question of Western sanctions. There's a kind of debate among people in the West, including opinion formers, about are they playing a role or not in modifying Russian policy? Are they a factor, do you think? Do you think this is something Mr. Putin cares about in order not to have Western sanctions get worse?
I'm sure he does. I think I have a strong belief that these Western sanctions are not neglected by the Russian political elite as they're trying to present it. As Bridget, you've put it very right, all people have different opinions. Even in the West, many people are saying that very well know that these sanctions is just a play from Washington and London and Paris and Berlin. Just they're trying to play and see that they're trying to do something, and they cannot just sleep over the fact that the borders have been changed in Europe. But at the same time, I feel that in a long period of time, these sanctions will work, and this is unfortunately the only space the Western powers have now for maneuver in their relations with Russia. And the fact why it will work is because these sanctions are they are breaking the whole Moscow political elite into two different parts. There is a part which can travel and have properties, and their kids can go and study in the Western countries, and there is this minimal but more powerful part of political elite which is confined to Russia and to other Asian states, but they are not allowed to travel to Europe. And they, of course, feel undermined. They feel insulted even with the fact that their wives cannot do the Christmas shopping in Harrods.
Dmitry Lenin, what's your view on this? You talked about the pressures that President Putin was under, including from nationalists, a general national mood in Russia, but also those a particular group of Russians who have a very particular view, pressure from Eastern Ukrainians to come to their aid. Do you think Mr. Putin also weighs this up against Western sanctions? Does that modify the policy choices he makes, or is he more geared towards this, the pressures at home, if you like, or the pressures of Russian speakers in Eastern Ukraine?
Well, it's a very delicate balance, I would imagine, and I don't know, whatever one thinks of Putin, I think any serious analyst or politician recognizes him as a pretty good chess player. So he will have factored it in, the sanctions, the risks, and he can be bold, as we have seen with Crimea. I know it's a very painful issue, but you're not talking about Putin going out and grabbing Crimea. You're talking about 1.5 million people out of the 2 in Crimea wanting to go back.
Well, I guess it depends on how you
count it.
How you count.
Oh, that's Ukrainian techniques or what?
No, but there
How
are
you
evidently
count
Russian
it?
techniques.
Come on. Oh, that's really.
Okay, you're referring to a referendum that's not been recognized internationally. And in fact, I'm going to have to chip in here and do what I pretty much do in my daily life, which is debunk a number of myths that you just started propagating and fact-checked a few of your statements. For example, the one about the proof of Russian weapons. Yes, Kalashnikovs were made and designed in Russia, but in Russia, in the Russian army, you use AK-100 series Kalashnikovs, and these are exactly the ones found in the hands of the separatists. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, Ukrainian army happens to carry most of the time AK-70s, an older version of the same.
74s,
maybe 74s, but anyway, it's AK-70 series. Modifications of AK-70, not higher up. And the AK-100s were found in Crimea when the little green men came, and then Putin recognized them as the Russian military in a public speech when Crimea was annexed and adjoined.
So you're talking about the Crimea, right?
Let me finish. I'm talking about first Crimea, and then in East Ukraine, where we find exactly the same situation. As far as proof goes of Russian presence and the presence of Russian weapons, you needn't look any further than today's statement from the Foreign Ministry, because when the Ukrainian army pushed away some separatists in eastern Ukraine, in a locality, they found packaging, boxes basically, from the weapons provided by the Russian army, intact with instructions, manuals, and dates of issue from Russian stock. The pictures are already online. They were released today. Then let's move on to the tanks. You say, who cares about 3 tanks crossing the border when Ukraine has... Even if. No, there is proof of that. And there's been photographic evidence, like you mentioned, including evidence from NATO satellites and civic satellites. And unfortunately, the Russians are not considering that evidence. But moreover, it's important that the Ukrainian 500 tanks, or however many we have, are located on our territory. These are the tanks that belong to the Ukrainian army. The 3 tanks that crossed the border, and in fact there were 5, 4 of them shot in 2 different locations, were the Russian tanks that came from a particular stock in Rostov Oblast. And you know that, well, I know that anyway, our intelligence knows that, and NATO knows that, and you are not willing to consider those facts. And
Okay, can I come back to that? The BBC reports the story as saying that the NATO photographs provided by NATO appear to suggest that the tanks came from Russia. That is the wording the BBC uses, not me. So it probably is inconclusive in the eyes of the BBC.
yes, if you use one source of information, it's inconclusive. But when you top it up with other sources, the evidence is pretty conclusive.
Can I just ask you, Katya? Victor was suggesting, you know, there have been a couple of positive things very, very recently. So he injected a note of optimism into this. Do you feel in the last few weeks that there's any reason for optimism? I mean, the fact that President Poroshenko met President Putin at the D-Day event, the fact they spoke on the phone yesterday, do you think
Yes,
there's any
I
reason?
feel that there is ground for optimism. I mean, the president is reshuffling the government, hopefully in a way that will be able to make the dialogue with the Russian diplomats more productive. We are engaging in negotiations on gas, even though they're not going anywhere yet. Now we're going to court on gas. Both the Russians are suing Ukrainians and Ukrainians are suing Russians, which is, in my opinion, better than the stalemate. I mean, yes, it may be a painful process. Yes, it may be a long time before we solve this problem, but at least we will move from this dead zone where we've been in this tug of war for a long time, when the Russians were accusing Ukrainians and Ukrainians were accusing Russians. So we made the first step towards resolution, which I think is a reason for optimism.
Can you share that view?
Yeah, I'm absolutely optimistic about future of Ukraine, because there is a joke now in Ukrainian social media that actually Ukrainians own Mr. Putin a huge monument on Maidan, because starting November he did what Ukraine could not do starting 1991 when it gained its independence, because Putin brought sense to what Ukrainian people are and what Ukraine is about. Unfortunately, it came through the war, where almost 200 people already died, and it's a huge price to pay for the state building and nation building. But we really are optimistic, because now things become much more clearly who is who in this game, and Ukrainians become more and more self-reliant in what they are going to build. They're not looking to the west, they're not looking to the east. There is no one except what Ukrainians themselves can do. Otherwise, it was a situation which reminded me the Salman Rushdie book when the bear was called dog and the dog was called bear, and they moved all the way around, and you cannot say what is over there. So Luka was not sure who is who behind him, and now all this, cheap discourse of brotherhood and all other things which Russia was promulgating around, it just fall down, and you can easily see what's behind the curtain, what the real intentions are, how cheap the friendship is, and how close we are back to the times of the Cold War. And the only problem, again, I would repeat that Ukraine appeared to be in the really bad neighborhood, and this Cold War is unfolding just in the middle of Ukraine, but it could happen anywhere else, because nobody can say that Ukraine would be the very last stop in this powerful grab. We cannot say that Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia cannot be the next, because there is no any things that can now guarantee that. The international system is broken, and it happened in Ukraine, but it just started with Ukraine.
Okay, let's open it up for a few questions before we come on to part 2. Yes. Oh, there's a mic coming. Hold on for the mic. Do say who you are if you want.
Thank you very much. Dennis Marks, independent freelance writer and broadcaster. I'd like to ask this question to all four panelists, and it's about neutrality and non-alignment. It's about the meaning of the word Ukraine, if you like, Ukraina on the border. What I'd like to ask is what your feeling, you panelists, is about the pressures of alignment with blocs dominated both by Moscow and also by Washington and the EU prior to the outbreak of hostilities a few months ago. In other words, the Russians were using a customs union, as they described it, to create an Eastern Bloc. But at the same time, and this is particularly true of Crimea, and as it was true of Georgia, in exactly the same way, Washington and the European Union were effectively trying to act as a magnet to draw Ukraine into alignment with Western blocs. Now, given Ukraine's geopolitical position, surely there is an argument for non-alignment, for neutrality, and for non-involvement in major blocs. I'd like to know their opinion on that.
Okay, before we come to the panel, let's get some other points. Gentleman at the front.
Thank you very much. My question is also for all four of you. My name's Ewan Grant. I've recently returned from working in Kiev and Odessa, and I was previously the UK Customs intelligence analyst for the ex-Soviet countries and international organised crime. My question is, how can we take seriously the denials from Moscow of involvement, given that it took the then governments in Moscow 45 years to admit the Katyn massacre, and that, as I understand, until perhaps only a very few years ago, and maybe even now, the Communist Party in the Duma, or parts of it, were still attempting to deny that the Katyn massacre was carried out by the Soviet government. I have to accept that it is not unknown for politicians in Britain to lie, and I would refer you to the comments of, over many years, by the Irish politician Gerry Adams, that he's never been a member of the IRA.
Okay, a few more questions. Yes, gentleman there at the back. Pass it back.
Hello, my name is Vadim Nikita. I work for Strauss Friedberg. It's a due diligence and forensics company. I wanted to ask the panel what they think. We kind of, this conflict is seen as East and West, Russia, Ukraine, and to what extent can we also look at it as a conflict between the past and the present, in the sense that Soviet nostalgia, you look at people going, the Lenin monuments that they gather around and the flags that are used with the Soviet emblems. To what extent is this a manifestation of the unresolved issue of the breakup of the Soviet Union, which was also involved a very controversial plebiscite, similarly to the ones that were happening, where people seemed to answer yes to preserving the Soviet Union, and yet it was broken up. And so to what extent is this, perhaps people are they really aligning with Russia, or are they projecting their view that they are in fact Soviet citizens who are stranded following the collapse, and are trying to work out where they stand? They're still in this kind of weird temporal exile. So I just wanted to hear your views about that, whether there's this third way of looking at the conflict.
Okay, let's take one more question. From this side, is any hands going up? No? Okay, gentleman at the front.
Well, my general point is just about the Western governments, in terms of their outrage about Russia's annexation of Crimea. I just make one is that they supervised the secession of Kosovo from Serbia. So what I'm saying is that they tore up the rule book of international law over territorial integrity. So what I'm saying is it really is rather hypocritical of then to complain about what Russia has done to Crimea. And furthermore, of course, Western governments have failed to take any action against Israel over its annexations of East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, one more. Just this gentleman in the green shirt, and then we'll come back to the panel quickly.
Thank you. This question might be more suited to the second half, but there was mention
well, then
of...
hold on to it.
Okay.
Hold on to it. Okay, let's start with Victor. And so we've got 4 questions here. Mm-hmm. You can address all 4, or you can take your pick if you like. There's the
no, I can go through all 4.
Okay.
Yeah,
let's
I'm brave enough.
Because we want to get to part 2. This is a really interesting
the first question was very interesting about non-alliance and alliance, and where does Ukraine sees itself. I think my Ukrainian... don't want to say comrades because it will remind you of the Soviet times, but the lady from Ukraine and Evgeny will give us a more detailed information. But as I recall, when Ukraine became independent, Ukraine did pass a law in the Supreme in Verkhovna Rada. Let me speak Ukrainian. They did pass a law that Ukraine will not be part of any political alliance or any military alliance. So any military alliance. Yes, so and it's part of your constitution. So I'm sure you'll give us more insight about this. But I have to just remind you, or maybe some people are not so familiar with the affairs in Ukraine, that part of Ukraine is Russian. In fact, ethnically speaking. I mean, you have to consider that, I don't know, 30, 40, 45% of Ukrainian citizens are Russian in their ethnicity, and they consider themselves to be Russian, and they speak only Russian language. From my experience, I can tell you...
only Russian language. That's not conclusive.
Okay.
And I think that people in eastern Ukraine would argue with you.
Let me just finish what I'm trying to say. From my experience, I've lived 12 years in Kharkov. Kharkov is the second biggest city in Ukraine, located 80 kilometers away from the Russian border. For all these 12 years, I've never heard a single Ukrainian word while living in Kharkov, so it is part of Ukraine. I mean, all the Russians in Ukraine watch Russian TVs, read Russian books, so it would be very difficult for them, for example, to pass a law or to live in a country like India or what other countries were very prominent members of non-alliance agreements and pacts globally. So you just have to consider that, yeah, Kremlin and Moscow have been very active on in foreign policy for the last 15 years, and they've been dragging Ukraine into its own sphere of influence. But for Ukraine passing such law and being independent from any alliance is very difficult because part of the population is part of this Russian culture, sphere, and so on. That's my opinion to you. I mean, that's my answer to your question. The second question was about whether Kremlin can be trusted. The gentleman very rightly gave us an example of an Irish politician, quote, I mean, in general, politicians are very hard to trust. And with Soviet politics, we have a very long-standing history of Kremlin secrecy and Moscow secrecy. You have to remember that when Chernobyl blew up in '86, it took 3 days for Soviet state to announce that in the newspaper, and that's a scale of I don't need to explain you the scale of the whole of everything what happened in Chernobyl and how it was important for people to know within hours what has happened at the doorstep. No, Kremlin cannot be trusted. Of course, I mean, well, that's my own opinion. And another example I can give you is that Mr. Putin, again, in one of his own press conferences, said initially that there is no Russian army in Crimea, and those green, polite men, as they've been called now, that they even I remember the journalist gave him a second question, whether can you confirm that those people who are now in Ukraine, the military in Ukraine, they have not been trained by the Russian army. And Mr. Putin said, yes, I can confirm that they were not trained by our forces. But then 10 days later, he mentioned that some medals were given to the Russian officers for taking part in a Crimea operation. And actually, Mr. Kadyrov has been also given a medal by Crimea, by the Russian Crimea now, for helping to bring Crimea back to Russia. So there are so many contradictions that actually the Crimean crisis showed to the general public that the politicians which are currently now there should not be trusted. That's the general opinion. And talking about the Yeah, not only there, exactly. And talking about the future past conflict, whether this is a conflict between people who want to live in the Soviet Union or people who want to live in the future, I mean, the way they see their country in the future, this is you can position this conflict this way, but I think it's more. It's a more complex. There is more complicity in the whole Ukrainian conflict. It's not only about. You cannot say that people who are in the east part of Ukraine want to go back to the Soviet laws and they want to live in the Soviet Union. No, they don't. This idea. I mean, the philosophy of Soviet Union, the red flags and the Lenin monuments. They've been all hijacked by the people who are trying to, by the political forces who are trying to gain independence from Kyiv. This is just. They won't be communist if they get this independence. The Eastern Ukraine will not become a communist state, and they will not introduce the laws of the Soviet Union. What they will do, I mean, what they're just trying to do is they're trying to play on a nostalgia of the elder population and elder generation. That's the only thing which they're doing. And the gentleman has been talking about Kosovo and Crimea. I don't think these things can be compared. You have to remember, I mean, I'm not a specialist in Yugoslavia and in that part of the world, but you have to remember that there were people persecuted in Kosovo. Serbs entered Kosovo and they've been killing the local population in dozens.
We were told that.
Okay, let's not get into a discussion
Well,
about
the only thing I can underline here and emphasize that Russians were never persecuted in Crimea. Russians always lived there peacefully, and Ukrainians never tried to push them away from the territory, or they never forced them to speak Ukrainian. So Russians had all their rights in Crimea, and I don't think these two conflicts can be compared.
Okay, thanks, Victor. Katya, let me come to you. Let's keep it brief because we have another subject to address too. If you agree with Victor on stuff, then don't repeat it. But if you've got other stuff to add, please do.
I disagree entirely about the fact that parts of Ukraine are Russian, and here's the evidence. When I was editing one of the pieces on how organic the separatist and pro-Russian movements are in Ukraine recently, just a month ago, that got me thinking into how can I rely on hard evidence to support the claims or debunk the claims. And I went to the statistics, the voting statistics for the last parliamentary election, because we had an array of parties, including extremely pro-Russian parties, that stood for a lot of language issues and so on and so forth. And I looked at the voting statistics for those parties, the support for those parties, and I was actually quite amazed to discover that they had the highest rating of support in Sevastopol, which is predictable, but their rate was 5%. Only 5% of the population supported a truly pro-Russian party in Sevastopol. The rate was much lower in eastern Ukraine. And that was Ruski Bloc I'm talking about. I don't know how familiar you are with the landscape. I mean, even when people voted for the Party of Regions in eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine, for example, they voted basically for our bandits. They voted for local people who would represent their interests. They were not voting because they were so pro-Russian. They were voting because they understood and shared the values. So it's about the shared values. Ukraine.
What about this question of neutrality, though?
Yes, neutrality is a very interesting issue, and it's actually an issue that's shifting in Ukraine at the moment. Because yes, on one hand, we do have the constitution, and it spells out quite clearly that Ukraine cannot be a part of any military alliance, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, economic alliances are very different. And there are great advantages to be a part of the economic alliances. There are studies done about that, and so on and so forth. And yes, there's been a huge debate over the past years as to which alliance Ukraine should be joining. And Ukraine, in fact, has been wavering. And there were studies that proved that, yes, non-alliance would be great. Open trade with all of the unions would be wonderful. And that would be the most wonderful thing for Ukraine. But unfortunately, this option is not available because the way the customs union is constructed is extremely, its rules are extremely obstructive. You're either a member of that club and not a member of any other club, and that's not the case in the DCFTA with the DCFTA. We can go into more detail with that because there have been numerous studies done both in Ukraine and abroad about it. But in any case, even if that was not true, if I'm telling you complete lies, there's also the sovereign choice of Ukraine. And the people of Ukraine have been increasingly voting in support of a union with the European Union, or some sort of closer alliance with the European Union. In fact, as a result of Crimean annexation and the war in eastern Ukraine, we have had a surge in support for NATO alliance. And membership in NATO. Now, an amazing 55% of Ukrainian population think that we should be a part of NATO. And that's a historic precedent. It's never happened in Ukraine before, because we realize that we are going to be a stronger nation as a part of NATO. And this shift is literally only just happening. So, you know, I think that Ukraine will have a huge national debate about whether to be a part of any alliances and what kind of alliances they have to be. But this is where we are edging towards. And the events in eastern Ukraine and Crimea are pushing us in that direction as well.
If I can add to this, basically, Russia now is doing an amazing job of making sure that its worst nightmares about Ukraine joining NATO becomes reality. Because what happened in the east of Ukraine showed the people that Ukraine alone cannot struggle this battle. And that's basically what moves it to the figures Katya just mentioned. And this what polls shows. If polls last year or 2 years before showed probably 30% of those who've been supportive, now it's 50 plus. And the same, even more with European Union. So the more Russia is pressing on Ukraine, the more it pushes it towards NATO and other alliances where Russia would not be present. And let me give you a little bit more polls explaining another issue. You mentioned that part of the Russians, part of Ukraine is Russian.
I think you got me wrong.
Yeah,
Sorry, I didn't mean that Ukraine is Russian.
Yeah.
I meant that part of Ukraine has a dominant Russian population, and they consider themselves to be Russians.
Yeah, I would say that consider themselves to speak Russian and other things, but not all of them are ethnically Russian. Even those who speak Russian very often are just Ukrainian who happen to speak Russian. The figures taken at the very beginning of March, when intervention in Crimea started, showed that only, the question was, would you like your region to join Russia? So the highest percentage was in Crimea, around 50%, 50 something. And then we go from region to region. Donetsk and Luhansk, where the battle now unfolding, was around 35%, and then Kharkiv with 20%. So that's not very high percentage of those who are willing to change status quo. And so there is no kind of conversation that people in Ukraine are just, crying to Putin, just, help us from deadly embrace of Ukraine. Otherwise, there was a, flash mob in social media where people whom you called ethnic Russians were showing, I'm Russian, but Mr. Putin, please do not defend me. I don't want to die. And that was very massive and very effective flash mob to show the real attitude of people. People want to be in peaceful and stable Ukraine. And even those who are looking for any kind of recreation of Soviet Union, they also silently vote for status quo just because they also don't want to be killed. That's very simple consideration. And when, just finish, one of my students approached me and said, I'm not feeling, very confident and happy in my profession. What would you suggest, where is the happiness? And my answer was, please come closer to the window. If you don't see any Russian tanks over there, it's already happiness, So it's really how values changes in terms of things ongoing. And very last answer to Kosovo-Crimea dichotomy. It would be absolutely wrong approach because Kosovo was the place where ethnic cleansings were happening. And in eastern Ukraine, it never happened except in the wild imagination of Russian media. Because if you remember, 2 days ago, a Russian journalist was killed in action. And by the way, he was wearing military outfit, and presumably he was wearing weapons as well. And he was saying that now friend of my relative said to me that ethnic cleansing are happening and Ukrainian army is killing everybody they can find around. And it was exactly on the day before Ukrainian army left the region. So nobody was there. But he was saying that on the air, that just almost in front of me, Ukrainian army is just killing everybody, it's ethnic cleansing happening, which is total nonsense. And so that's probably one of the reasons we cannot compare Crimea and Kosovo, because nobody was killed in Crimea. It was just annexed overnight. Nobody killed.
Let me come on to you, Dmitry, for your anything you'd like to say in response to what we've heard from the panel, the 4 questions we had from the floor.
Yeah, there's plenty. On Kosovo, Crimea, I think, well, according to the figures that I have, and what I want to say, I guess, is that I've been reading newspapers for 50 years, at least, more than 50 years, starting with Soviet papers. So I can kind of read between the lines. It's a pretty good school. So when I say something, it's facts that I've screened, or things that I've screened. So there's about 60,000 people now that have fled from East Ukraine to Russia. Rostov,
Not true.
You just saying to me that it's not true.
No, we have a story debunked that on our website.
Well,
we just call the Russian
that's-
Migration Service and
excuse
ask
me,
how many people applied for
excuse
the
me,
refugee
sir.
status.
We're going to deal with that in the second part of the...
Well, we can deal with it now. Go ahead.
all right.
Yeah, so Russian Migration Service says there is no Ukrainian refugees over there.
Say
That
it
was
again?
the Russian Migration Service did not confirm any refugees over there beyond Ukrainian-Russian border.
So you read too much.
Yeah,
between
you
the
read too
lines.
much between lines. It's bad for
So,
journalism.
did I come here to be accused of lying?
No,
I mean,
it's
are you
just not
serious?
complete
Are you
facts you
serious?
got
People-
from
Is it possible?
We
Do
are.
you know about
we-
hundreds of people killed in East Ukraine, including civilians?
We are actually very
Yeah.
serious. In fact, we're so serious that
Yes.
we check the information.
Yeah.
We
Are you
actually
accusing me
call-
of not having checked mine?
You just said, you read between the lines, that
No,
60,000
not
people
between the
emigrated
lines.
to Russia.
I
and we
said about
we,
screening information.
Okay, well, we screened.
We
Yevgeny
fact check
and
it
his
actually.
service
Yeah, I don't know what you
called
mean
the
under
Russian
screening.
Immigration
We are
Service.
fact checking it. I mean, we check facts before publishing.
Well, okay.
Or we
okay,
check
if
facts
that's...
what you've published. I'm in Russian media, and we find a lot of inconsistencies over there. A lot of.
Talk about inconsistencies in Ukrainian media, my.
Well,
We
let's
do.
talk about
Let's
that.
talk about it. We are an open country. We can talk about anything.
It's democracy.
Do you think I'm afraid of discussing anything?
Dimitri,
No,
do you
No,
want
you live in
we are not
Britain,
afraid
right?
anymore of
Yes.
anything.
You know, I'm very happy to go on to
Okay,
the second part of the
yes,
topic. But I don't know if there's something you want to address
Yeah,
before we do that.
Soviet nostalgia versus today. Interesting issue on demography. That younger people are all for, Europe and all that. It's interesting that younger people who have never experienced Soviet reality are so scared of it or so critical of it. Those people who have had experience of Soviet life are not, are in fact nostalgic. Isn't that strange? That's so far as choices go. I mean, I'm perfectly fine with Ukraine choosing Europe. Fine. Neutrality and alliances. The fact is, and I have checked that,
Good.
is that the association agreement with EU was offered in response to Russia's offer of the customs union. Nobody is quite sure, in the British academia anyway, that the association agreement was for real. The EU membership is probably not for the next 25, 30, whatever years. So let's not get our hopes high on that. as far as NATO goes, I mean, definitely not in the condition Ukraine is in. And also talking about stats, 55% you said, right? In favor
That's
of...
a poll. That's not stats. Yeah,
well,
that's
that's
a poll.
still
It's an opinion.
figures. It's also interesting to look into those figures, and we'll see that, say, in the western parts of Ukraine, the share of those people favoring NATO membership is much higher, while in the east of the country is much lower, is certainly under one half. So, and therein lies a very interesting fact about the nature of Ukraine as a nation state, is that it's split.
Have you been to Maidan? Have you been to Euromaidan?
No.
Well, I spent quite a lot of time there reporting, and I have to tell you that there were people from every region, every single region. It didn't matter what language they spoke, whether it was Russian or Ukrainian, they were all there fighting for the same cause, which proved to a lot of Ukrainians, to ourselves, because we didn't care about you on Maidan, we cared about ourselves. It was about us and the choice of values for us. And we proved to ourselves that we are not what the political spin doctors and the Russian media are trying to spin us. We are the same nation, and we do rejoice in our diversity.
Well, tell that to
Yes,
the
we
people in
are.
Lugansk and Donetsk. Why don't you?
Yeah, as soon as the war would stop over there, we would try to deliver
I think
that
here I
message.
can support Dmitry. Actually, that's what I meant when I talked about part of Ukraine being Russian. You got me wrong, or I did probably say it in a wrong way. I'll rephrase it. Part of Ukraine is a dominant, as I said, has a dominant Russian population, and it's very difficult for them to imagine that the country in which they live would be part of NATO.
Why?
The reason for that is why? It's a very good question.
Not
I mean,
anymore.
and it's a very different story. I mean, we can talk about the Soviet West Soviet stance during the Cold War and different other things. But let me tell you one thing. When I came to Moscow in April this year, and I've been speaking to Russians there and asking them about, of course, they were all excited, and up to now, all of Russia is very excited up to unimaginable level how they have their Crimea back, part of their country. But the main reason, the way they justified why they annexed parts of Ukraine, is because they said, if we didn't do that, then NATO would have their own naval base in Crimea. This is the main justification for Russians to annex Crimea. Otherwise, NATO would come and put a military base just at the border, and our grandfathers, and I mean, they went into history, of course, saying that our ancestors fought for this land, and so on and so on. So for Russians, it's very difficult to accept that the NATO base will be on their borders. The same for the Russians who live in Ukraine. It will be very difficult to accept to live in a country which is part of NATO alliance. It's okay for you. You were probably born in Kyiv. I mean, you have to admit that Ukrainian society is a very divided society ethnically. There is a very even humiliating way of looking at people who live in the West, exposed by the people who live in the East. I mean, if you look at the history of Ukraine, you'll understand that most of the population, Russian population who live now in eastern part of Ukraine, their grandfathers, just third generations away, lived somewhere in Kursk or Voronezh or other parts of Russia, and they were just transported by this dreadful state system when people were just taken, lifted up, uprooted, and went and put down somewhere in those uninhabited, at that time, areas of Ukraine or Crimea. If you go to Crimea, it's the same story. So
Yes,
people
but
are still consider
again,
themselves to be Russians.
When you're making that point, you're substituting one notion for another. You were talking about Russian ethnicity when you should be talking about Russian origin, okay? You're saying they're Russians when you should be saying they're of Russian origin. You know, my surname is Polish. I speak Russian. In other words, I'm a typical Ukrainian. And, you know, there are a lot of Ukrainians with mixed backgrounds, including Russian backgrounds. Including, you know, Gagauz, you know, Bulgarians.
That's
you
right.
Take it, you name it.
By
And
saying
in Western
ethnically,
Ukraine,
first thing I say is culturally. Culturally, they are not. They don't read Lesya Ukrainka. They read Alexander Pushkin. I'm not saying who is better or worse, but I'm just saying that they consider themselves to be part of the Russian world. And
No,
this
no.
is, I mean, this is a fact you have to admit. And that's
No,
like
the fact
tens
that
of percent.
the fact
This
that
is
you have to
30% of
admit
Ukrainian
is that we've
population.
already moved on from that stage, and that's the point I was trying to make. And this is something that Maidan showed to us, that we are a different nation. We actually understand and accept that parts of the country are not like us. They are very different. That there are Crimean Tatars in Crimea, that there are Jews in Dnipropetrovsk, that there are Poles in Lviv Oblast, that there are Russians in Lugansk, and that's fine. We're fine. We're prepared to live with
Fantastic,
it. And
yes.
when immigration started of Crimean Tatars from Crimea, this is a wonderful story. I mean, they landed in the middle of Ukraine in a Russian-speaking region called Vinnytsia. They're helped by the Jewish community, and most of them are housed by the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and the Catholic Church. I mean, how much more variety do you get? And this is what it's about in Ukraine these days. It's about, it doesn't matter whether you speak Russian or Ukrainian, whether you're of Russian origin or not,
I'm
whether you
afraid
read
it
Lesa
does,
Ukrainka. Well,
I'm afraid it
It's
does.
a dream
because
world,
excuse me.
Ekaterina. This is something what we want Ukraine to
the
be.
first
But
instinct
today
of the
Ukraine
new
is not
government-
what you are describing right now.
this is where we're going. Exactly.
I would love Ukraine to be like that. I would love.
Can
But
I
the
just
facts
wrap
what's
up
happening in
this?
Lugansk and Donetsk shows us
Yeah.
completely
I
different
have
picture.
a great idea to wrap up this, argument about what is Ukraine about. It's 21st century around, and any country which says that everybody should be equal and the same over there, it probably belongs to the 19th century. If we are looking forward, we should recognize that, yes, we have very different people living in Ukraine with very different culture, language, religion, and that's exactly all the myths Russian media trying to use to fan another problems around, because they consider that to be a problem. And I agree with Katya that Ukraine moved to another stage where diversity is not a problem, as it's not a problem for Britain, it's not a problem for United States, for France, for anyone else. And those who would say that we need to make everybody equal would evidently bring us to the old model. We're basically talking then about Soviet Union, where everybody was equal to different extent, but still rhetorics was like that. And if we are talking about 21st century ideology, yes, everybody can use the language they want. If people in Donetsk and Lugansk would prefer to speak English, Russian, whatever, we can perfectly understand
This is a
them.
misrepresentation of what's actually happened.
Hang on.
The instinct, sorry, let me finish. The instinct of the new government in Kyiv was to limit the use of the Russian language.
No, it was never limited.
Sorry, it was reversed. The decision was reversed.
No.
It was a
And
It was
actually-
reversed. No, sorry, let me finish. Let me finish. But anyway, the people in Crimea, the people in East Ukraine were worried about the instincts of the people that came to power in Kyiv. And now Kyiv, it did reverse the decision to limit the use of the Russian language. It is telling the people in East Ukraine, you have nothing to worry about. And it's bombing them to make them admit that they have nothing to worry about. Yeah?
It's nonsense.
Let's just leave
It
this
is.
for a moment. There's a difference of opinion here. I think it's been very illuminating discussion, just the problems, the deep cultural problems that there are to overcome. But there's this other subject that we want to get onto, which is the question of the media, the role the media has played in this conflict. And I want to start with you, Yevgen, because you've been the founder of this organisation, StopFake.org,
Right.
which was created precisely in response to what you saw as this distortion of information from Russia. I don't want to have a slanging match here. I mean,
You're going to have to.
I'm going to have one, aren't I? But what I'm interested in is whether or not what we're looking at in Ukraine is something which is different from what has happened in other conflicts. So I wonder if you could give us a few examples of what it is that has worried you, which you think is new, that we're looking at a new stage of the use of the media.
What is new with this conflict compared to others? It's a really huge avalanche of propaganda which is pouring on Ukraine and on the West as well, and on Russian people as well by Russian media. And it's probably even more dangerous than military warfare itself, because it can damage much more people, because the war is quite local and it's just in 2 regions of Ukraine. But when we speak about propaganda, it reaches to every corner, and nobody can say that, well, I am safe because, as you put, I can read between the lines. We started our project in early March, and since then we already had more than 200 stories from Russian media debunked. They were completely falsified, distorted, and they mixed facts and fiction to the extent where people who are reading the news just cannot notice the blurring bound between facts and fiction. And you mentioned language. That was actually one of the first stories we published, and that's why I can answer your question. RIA Novosti reported that Ukraine is moving from Cyrillics to Latin alphabet. And that was exactly what brought people demonstrating to the street, and that was completely nonsense. And there was even no source mentioned in that news story. It was just one named expert, not excluded, that probably at some point Ukraine would move to Latin alphabet. And yeah, people were outside on the street just because RIA Novosti used it, and then it was fanned out through the social networks around. And with the internet, once it's out, you just cannot stop it, and very often you just cannot figure out from where the story originated. And we had many, many stories like that. Another story was that Ukraine is splitted, and it's the most favorite type of propaganda Russian media try to use, that Ukraine is so splitted that it's basically a failed state, and it's a matter of hours when it would be just gone. And it was about, one of the story was about the refugees, thousands of refugees. And the picture showing that was from Ukrainian-Polish border. And people were moving to Poland, what they do actually every weekend, moving back and forth, buying things and bringing them back. And the line was to that border. And even the sign on the border crossing was evident. So it was very naive approach, like people cannot just figure out where it was taken. And with the refugees, we just made a call to Russian Migration Service and asked how many Ukrainians applied for refugee status. Thousands, tens of thousands. The answer was 5. Just 5 people applied for refugee status. And that explained all the story, just one phone call. And also we explained to our readers how they can do the fact-checking themselves. Especially Russian media love to use pictures. For example, that picture, how do you know where it was taken?
Grozny.
Yes,
Minutka.
but you can easily say that it happened during Euromaidan, it happened in eastern Ukraine, it happens in Kyiv right now, and that's exactly what was happening. Pictures from Syria, Iraq, Kosovo were used to show that things were right now unfolding in Ukraine, and that was run by actually state-run media like Russia Today. The stories were from Itartas, from RIA Novosti, and quite reputable, some may say, sources. And it's very easy to debunk that, because now every picture comes with geolocation tools and metadata. You can just very easily check when and where it was taken. So this approach doesn't work anymore, and we try to explain to our readers how they can do it themselves. And the problem is that Russian media became a part of Kremlin state-run propaganda machine. And those journalists who work locally in the field in Ukraine are very often just, on detachment, embedded with insurgents, and very often are just, playing out the information insurgents want from them. And one of the example I already mentioned was about ethnic cleansing happening in front of the Russian television correspondent. Journalists from Russian military television Zvezda were detained by Ukrainian military, and they said, yes, we are usually told by our editors what we need to tell at every particular moment, because it coincides with what Russia politically or diplomatically does at that moment. So if Churkin is preparing the next United Nations Security Council meeting, you should show there is refugees, or you should show ethnic cleansing, or whatever would play well for Churkin to draw another resolution, you know, when they need it.
Over to you, Dmitry. You've talked about inconsistencies in the Ukrainian media.
Well, I've mentioned a few. I'm not going to defend, actually. I will agree to an extent with Yevgen about, you know, the misrepresentations in the Russian media. Fair enough, fair point. But, in my eyes, reading between the lines and through the lines and whatever, the Ukrainian media is at least as guilty of fakes, of falsehoods, of, I don't know, falsifying stuff. Sorry?
For example?
For example, do you follow Anatoly Shary, the journalist?
No, basically he is not
try him.
a part of our community.
What is your community? What is so special about your community that he's not accepted?
Well,
I mean, he's an honest guy.
All those who work as a journalist according to standards and journalistic ethics belong to my community.
You telling me that
others,
Russian journalists are ostensibly caught in Ukraine with arms in hand?
Yeah, actually Russian
And you were
journalists were
telling me
caught
that this
carrying
is
RPG rocket
proper
launcher
reporting?
in their cars, so
Oh,
that's
come
evident.
on. Oh, come on.
Yeah, that's a
That's
fact.
the mother of all fakes.
No, that's a
Oh.
fact. And they recognize that was
I think
their
the best
RPG,
example
you know.
here about the Ukrainian media will be the fact that if you look at the 3 most popular TV channels in Ukraine, I mean, one has to consider that Ukraine has been always an oligarchic state. It has been always ruled by oligarch groups with their own business interests. And all media in Ukraine up to now is divided between those oligarch groups. So you have to face those facts. The most popular TV channel in Ukraine belongs to Firtash, who is at the moment in prison or in hospital. In Austria. He was imprisoned by American authorities. The second, he's on bail. He has been released, yeah? Right. But anyway, he's the man in the middle of this Gazprom, NAFTA Ukraine, and all these gas deals, which actually Europe has been closing eyes on. There is a lot of... the second most popular TV channel in Ukraine belongs to Kolomoisky, who is another oligarch, who is the head of Dnipropetrovsk region now, has been put there after Maidan. And the third most popular channel, of course, belongs to the present president, Petro Poroshenko. So, I mean, when the media is in the hands of big business groups, you cannot call that this is an independent media. That's a very good example that it's not only the Russian media which is biased, which is, of course, unprecedented fact. Has never happened in Russian history, how Russian media can lie up to such extent. But Ukrainian media is not also a saint.
Let's just focus for a minute on the... Okay, yeah, come in, Katya.
Yeah, I was going to chip in here with two points. One is that, yes, it's true, and it's a huge problem for Ukraine that a lot of our media groups are owned by oligarchs, big oligarchs. But there's a silver lining, because those groups are actually competing among themselves, and you do get a variety of views through that competition. That's one point. The second point is there's an amazing number of startups in Ukraine as well, and influential media that are based online, that are streamed live, etc., etc. You know, Hromadske is the most recent example of a startup that just sprung up right before the revolution, and the likes of Stop Fake and there are numerous, Euromaidan PR, you name it. They're all run by volunteer groups as a rule. The most popular internet newspaper online is Ukrainska Pravda. It's an independent newspaper set up in 2000 by Georgy Gangadze, who, as you know, was killed, and so on and so forth. So if you have access to the internet, you have a lot of choice. And the media environment is not uniformic. It really is not. It's not broadcasting.
Yeah, the same with Russians. I mean, Russians who are interested in the news and who don't just watch the first state channel, they can always log into the internet, go to the BBC Russia, CNN Russia, Al Jazeera Russia, Deutsche Welle.
Yeah, there's
lots of resources. I mean,
yeah, but that's not Russian media.
It's not Russian media, but
No,
I mean, of course, we are in a global world, and I mean, all the media is in Russian language.
Yeah, we're getting into technical points here because we need to look at penetration of the internet, and we need to look at popularity of the media and the weight that they carry. I would argue that in Ukraine, the share of independent media is a lot stronger, and the weight that they carry disproportionate weight on the media spectrum compared to the resources that they have. And in Russia, that's not the case, I'm afraid.
Can I just add very quickly to that? Comparing Ukrainian and Russian media, I can say that 1/3 of all visitors to our website is from Russia. So we have 1 million unique visitors a month. So 1/3 of them would come from Russia because we are writing in Russian. And the third of all donations, because we are crowdfunding, are also coming from Russia. So that says that, yes, Russians are looking for alternative information, and ironically, Ukrainian media is providing that access to free and uncensored information.
I mean, you partly answered what I was going to ask, actually, which is if there is this distortion bias on both sides, and it's important to debunk myths or reveal fakes. I mean, you said, Yevgeny, this approach doesn't work anymore. But I just thought, well, I'm not sure that's true. I mean, I was in Moscow quite recently, and I think there are a lot of people there who do sincerely believe what they're hearing on the main state media. So maybe 1 million people in Russia, that sounds a lot in Russian population, that's not quite so many, especially if some of them might not actually be in Russia at the time. And also, maybe the most important place where this information needs to make a difference is in the physical area which is in contention, which is in eastern Ukraine. So how easy is it to stop the fakes? How easy is it to change minds? I mean, are we seeing a world where actually the traditional propaganda on state television has turned out to be much more effective than we thought? And actually, what are the tools to combat it? I mean, because I think everyone here there's some consensus on the panel that there is a problem. And the question is, does modern technology help you combat it, or maybe not?
Yeah. Not really. Not really. I mean, this democratization of journalism, I don't think it's doing its job. On the one hand, you get this tremendous variety of sources. On the other hand, you got amateurs doing that. And you got dishonest people as well. Fair point. On both sides, on all sides. And actually, there's one more thing that I think needs to be brought in. It's the way the whole situation is being portrayed in the West, in the Western media. That's something we haven't touched upon. And that ties in with something Yevgeny brought up earlier about Prime Minister Yatsenyuk referring to the rebels in the east of Ukraine.
Yeah, that's from your article, actually.
Oh, thanks. I'm being quoted. As subhuman, not inhumane, subhuman.
Not inhuman. Inhuman, it was.
No, hold on.
I have Ukrainian version of it.
I have the version published on the Ukrainian embassy's site in the United States.
And I have.
So I went straight to the source. Well, that's the word that the Ukrainian embassy in the United States used.
Yeah, but would you agree that those people who are shooting at the plane and those who sponsored them are inhuman? Would you agree with that?
Or subhuman? Let's agree.
There is no such a word.
Inhuman and inhumane.
Inhumane.
Different words in English.
They are different words, and I agree that it's not a very nice thing to shoot down a plane.
Nice.
It's not a
not a nice thing to kill 49 people.
No, come on,
I agree.
people.
No, yeah.
Come on, people. What are you talking about? Are you talking about the military guys that fly in to kill civilians in Lugansk?
There are also people.
Is that
families with kids?
Is that all right? Because they're subhuman?
No.
No. See, at least we agree on something.
I'm talking about killing military. Yeah. It's not good as well.
Well, it isn't good. No war is good ever.
Exactly.
But it wasn't people from Lugansk and Donetsk that moved to Western Ukraine and started killing people there.
Because we know
it was people from Kyiv and the West who came to Lugansk and Donetsk and began killing people
and
there.
both of us know whom Yatsenyuk meant when he mentions that. Where are those people who are sending insurgents and sponsoring them and providing them with weaponry? We all know where that person
all know. I
is
don't.
Let's take a few final questions.
Yes. The gentleman had his hand up here. Yeah. Let's take a round of questions.
I wasn't going to comment, actually. I'm an American. Between 1972 and Glasnost, I worked with SMOT, the Russian Free Trade Union, with the Campaign Against Psychiatric Abuses in the Soviet Union, with Index on Censorship. I've worked with 7 human rights groups, actually, and it's troubled me enormously that I've appeared 7 times now on Voice of Russia radio. And the reason I've done that is because the propaganda war is so intense on both sides. There's so much disinformation. There's so much complete superficial historical understanding of what's going on there. I also wrote a huge book about the Ukraine, which focused on the Nazi invasions of the Ukraine. And I came here tonight because I really thought that I probably had it wrong being in Voice of Russia radio. And I thought you would come and you would clarify things to me. But what I'm hearing, I'm afraid, is a kind of hysteria and a kind of paranoia. And as I sit here and listen to all of you, Victor and Dmitry, who I've been prepared to suspect, I confess this, Dmitry, they have been describing Ukraine as it is now to me. And I think that the Russians are in considerable troubles. This is not the Cold War. I'm not a great fan of Putin, actually. I think he's rather caught by surprise in this. I think the economics of this has made it impossible for NATO to get in there. I think it's very unworthy for you to be talking about getting NATO in there. There were promises made with Gorbachev, you know very well, and this is never going to, this was not in the cards, not in the cards. And I know the Human Rights Watch 4 or 5 days ago came out with a report saying that there was heavy weaponry being used on your own citizens by your president. And I know the Human Rights Watch very well. I'm sure they're telling the truth. I've seen it. Innocent people have been killed in the street. And as a result of that report, I think Poroshenko has pulled back. He's saying he wants quiet in the East. I think we're sort of moving towards, and I would suggest that you both maybe calm down a little bit, because I don't hear an awful lot of truth coming from this. This is, why should you say that Dmitry is not telling the truth because he's a Russian? This is appalling. No. We're supposed to be having a quiet discussion here, trying to arrive at shared truths. I'm now very glad I appeared in Voice of Russia radio, actually.
Okay, there's a lady back there with a hand up, yeah.
I just wanted to say our 2 guests from Ukraine just showed what the media nowadays does. There is always somebody with agenda advancing their own issues, and it has been just shown.
Okay, gentleman down at the front.
I just thought, I'm Oliver Buller, I'm a journalist. While we're fact-checking, the European Association Agreement with Ukraine began to be discussed in 2008. It was 2 years before the custom union was conceived of, just saying, Dmitry. I'm interested in media, in the use of new media by the Russians. I think anyone who's got a presence on Twitter would notice that the Russians have got very good at using a lot of people on Twitter to drown out discussion. If I say things, I get a lot of comments which maybe go off Twitter for a while until they've gone away. I'm just wondering, do your websites, do you face social media attacks? That's sort of, I suppose, just what I'm interested in, really.
Let's answer that question immediately because it's a specific one.
It's very common. Attacks are very common. We're hearing the same from colleagues, both in Ukraine and abroad. And it doesn't matter what country you're talking about, whether it's Germany or the US or Britain. Everyone's got hate mail. And in fact, it's becoming a problem because what we call this troll problem, which is created artificially. And we have sufficient proof to say that we have, there've been screenshots of HR agencies that are recruiting people to work online on behalf of the Russian media, Russian PR agencies hired by the government, and so on and so forth. There have been investigations of that. They're basically killing debate, and it's true worldwide. It's one of the problems that is yet to be addressed internationally, I think. So yes, we're seeing that, and
Can I add just
briefly? Yeah.
Yeah, our Stop Fake website was heavily attacked just after 1 hour of its existence, and it was more than 100 inquiries per second. And those who understand internet can say that you cannot do that manually. You can do that just with computers attacking the website very heavily. And we were paralyzed for 24 hours after launching the project. And then we moved it to, I would not tell you where it's very well protected now. And IT people from basically all over the world, offered their help to secure it, and now it's safe and it works much better than it used to do.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, I was wondering what the panel make of Poroshenko's decision to retain Channel 5, and perhaps it might have been more in the spirit of the Maidan to divest of his media assets. And I suppose, and I don't know if you agree, if it's a signal that he realizes that the media war is actually a very important front on which he needs to fight.
Okay, yeah, gentleman over there.
Thank you. I'm Andy Hunter from the Ukrainian Institute in London. I think in terms of the coverage that's been especially in the Russian media, I've seen many friendships that have been lost, especially in terms of the relationship now between Ukrainians and Russians. In terms of the propaganda war, I think what we are seeing, what my view is in terms of the actual war itself, the way the Russian have a very well-oiled and a very well-funded propaganda machine that is a juggernaut that's moving forward. What I've seen in Ukraine, what's quite inspirational, is that the war is being fought by journalists who are mainly volunteers, the likes like Yevhen and the team they're doing. And I think that's quite inspirational, that they are devoting a lot of their time without any money, trying to get the truth out. I think the role of journalism and civil society post-Maidan has a big future to play in Ukraine. And I mean, my question is, do you think in terms of once the conflict is over, what is the role of mainly of journalists in terms of controlling the new government? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, there's another hand up here.
I wasn't going to speak. My name is Masha Karp, and I write for the Rights in Russia website and belong to this NGO. I just wanted to say that quite an important part of Russians who support Ukraine has not been represented in today's discussion. And when I heard these attacks on the Ukrainian colleagues from the West, I was completely appalled, because I think that in terms of trying to dispel the fog that the Russian media is doing, the Ukrainians have done wonders, and there are plenty of Russians who are following these Ukrainian websites because they find much more truth there than they can find in the Russian website. So it's not a Russian-Ukrainian divide as simple as a borderline. It is very much a support for the nearly fascist regime that unfortunately I'm afraid we're seeing being created in Russia, and the attempts to get rid of a really corrupt and old-fashioned Soviet regime with the remains of the Soviet mentality that Ukrainians are fighting against. It's a much wider issue than the debate between Russia and Ukraine. It's a debate about the future of the world as we have known it, because it is fascism rising and raising its head again. And I think media is extremely important here, because as Orwell said in the Spanish War, you know, this is not such a new thing as a propaganda war, or as a propaganda war that we're seeing now. We saw it in 1937, and Orwell understood about communism because he saw how his friends were called fascists by the same lot who is in charge of Russia now, the KGB.
Okay, let's go to the panel. Katya, would you like to start? Sure. These are final comments. Pick up what you've heard from the floor if you'd like to. And I mean, I think, you know, interesting things that I take away from the last few comments, this question of how important the media war is, so that's why Poroshenko didn't want to divest himself of his own interest in it. The role of journalists post-conflict, and, you know, the question you raised yourself about trolling, killing debate. Where is it feels as though maybe this, what we're watching, the bigger implications of what we're watching are that the media is going to have an even bigger role in some of these conflicts.
Yeah, I'll just take it one at a time. The gentleman over here, his question was basically, are we accusing Dmitry because he's Russian and works for Russian media? No, we actually like Russians. And we like Dmitry, but we don't like lies, and that's what we're attacking.
So you're accusing me of lying?
We're actually fact-checking
Oh,
what the Russian media say, including Dmitry, and if we find inconsistencies with what we know, we try to debunk that, and that's what we're trying to do. Channel 5, the question...
NATO to become involved, so you're asking the whole world to see things as you do.
No, you're twisting what I said. I actually said that there was a growing popularity of the idea that Ukraine should become a NATO ally. I did not say it was an issue on the agenda. I just said that Ukraine's popularity of NATO in Ukraine is growing. That's the only point I made. So please, don't try and spin what I said.
I'm a liar. Americans
I'm
lie
saying
also.
don't try and spin what I
Everybody's a liar
said.
but you. And whenever anybody says anything, you smirk. This is a terrible debating technique. Why insult the people you're debating?
Okay, let's move on.
Okay. The next question was about Channel 5, to divest or to keep. I think that for Poroshenko to keep Channel 5 is extremely hypocritical and a huge conflict of interest. His argument is that he's keeping, he'll sell all the rest of his businesses, but he'll keep this one because it played such a great role during both revolutions, covering the events that no one else covered, blah, 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 blah. Okay, but that was in the past. Okay, a president should not have any business assets. And if he lives by the values that he declares, he should get rid of those assets. He should sell them honestly and truly, as opposed to just pass them on to his wife, his son, etc., etc. And whether this channel should be a part of the propaganda war, no, it should not be. It should not be in the hands of the government, because the government has plenty of other tools provided to them by the taxpayers to be able to fight that propaganda war. If they want, they can start, the likes of BBC in Ukraine and help it fight it that way. If they want, they can set up information centers and so on and so forth. I mean, they have infinite opportunities almost to do that. They do not need private channels to do the work for them, to do their dirty work for them. And this is what we're for. And this brings me to the next question of the role of independent media in controlling the president. I think this is hugely important. I think that the media is going to, I agree with you entirely, that the media is going to have an increasingly important role in Ukraine if we really do attempt to build the kind of society that we claimed we would like to build on Maidan, right? The society, the open values society, or the society with democratic values that endorses freedom of speech, freedom of the media. Then yes, the media will be a part of the control mechanism for the government, including the president.
Thank you. Dmitry.
We have been to Maidan, and that elevates us to heights from where we can see far ahead. Hopefully. I've been to demonstrations in Moscow with 500,000 people taking part around Sadovое Koltso. Yeah, the expectations were great. Not all of them materialized. 10 years ago, we debated Ukraine during the Orange Revolution. 10 years ago, we're back to more or less square one, even lower than that. It is tragic. I'm not enjoying what's going on. Trust me. In fact, on a personal note, I am 3/4 Ukrainian by blood. My grandfather had to flee Ukraine to avoid communist persecution. So there you have it. I mean, it's not about me getting paid by Putin or whatever. It's just tragic that before actually 91, before independence, Ukraine has been defined and has defined itself by not being Russia, to a significant extent, if we call a spade, by Russophobia. In 91, Leonid Kuchma, right? Kravchuk, what am I saying? Did a very good deal, splitting from the Soviet Union, with Crimea, with East Ukraine. The debate was there in 91. Russia did claim, a right to those territories, or at least a discussion about those territories. That's history. That's in a book by Serhiy Plokhy, a Ukrainian author living and working in the States. I'm sorry, this is important, I feel. So, in 91, that split was fortunate for one side, but not for the other. And now that unhappy deal has come back to haunt us, Russia and Ukraine. Therefore, the Crimea, therefore, the eastern sort of... If in 91 we, both Ukraine and Russia, had the proper statesman at the head, if we had agreed, I don't know, 30, 50-year period of transition to independence, to proper independence, to consider all the legal issues, territorial disputes, ethnic, linguistic, whatever, that would have been civilized. Now it isn't, and I'm sorry that it isn't. Well, I'll finish there. Thanks.
Thank you. You can.
Yeah, so, expectations after Maidan are really high. But you mentioned that's our expectation. Actually, that's just our expectations, because that's our country, and we can have that expectation, we can lose them, but we can also use them to make this country better, and hopefully this time we would make better our homework, and that's completely our internal business, how we would do that. If we fail, it's bad for us, Expectations are really very high, but there are one huge difference compared to what we have now and what we had before is a huge accountability of politicians and huge control from the side of journalists about what happened in politics around. So that's what not around before, even for the reasons that government was not allowing journalists to be in charge of this control. Now journalists are regaining this possibility, and that's how democracy should work. Government should be accountable, and that's why I think Poroshenko will reconsider his decision to retain Channel 5, because it would make Channel 5 just another watchdog of media organizations who would be very carefully looking at what he's doing and monitoring his activities in the same way we are monitoring activities of Russian media now, or Kremlin, or whatever. So Poroshenko is not an exclusion here. Yes, he will be monitored. And internet plays a dramatic role over here because, first of all, in Ukraine, nobody controls internet. So nobody can prosecute you just because you put something wrong on the internet. And people are very active in controlling government, using internet. Actually, a number of our new ministers, whom Russian media sometimes call fascist, are using internet to communicate with people, and anyone can write to them. It's Minister of Interior, Minister of Education, Minister of Foreign Affairs now is very famous as well, for many reasons. But all of them are very accessible for people, and anybody can write to their wall on Facebook and expect to receive an answer. I think that's what democracy should be about. Speaking of Western attacks on what happened in Ukraine and how we cover that, I'm not surprised, because when I saw an article by John Pilger in Guardian after all information he was using was already 10 times debunked and appeared to be completely wrong or lie, he was still using it, which means he prefer writing to reading what others are writing. And that's a pity, because that's not the level of Guardian to become a, mouthpiece for Kremlin efforts.
Can you then comment on Mark Franchetti?
And there were always people in the West as well who were more pro-Kremlin, and in Soviet times there were plenty of people who loved to come to Soviet Union to enjoy being there, be lavishly dined and wined and travel through Volga up and down, and then right that there was no any Holodomor around which killed millions of Ukrainians. There were many and Russians, yes, there were many Western journalists, writers who did that, and that's historical fact. and we do not want that everybody would agree with us, but we are really grateful that we receive a chance to explain what we are doing and not just being attacked and said that we are, smirking somewhere, or we are saying something in the wrong way, or we are hysterical. Yeah, if you would have a war in your country, I presume you would be hysterical as well. That's normal.
You're accusing me of being
No, I'm just answering your question. Why?
20 years of my life opposing the Kremlin. What are you talking about?
Yeah. I'm just answering your question. I'm not hysterical. It's a war in my country.
Let me stop this personal discussion. I don't really have a lot of comments about the media. Everything has been really covered. But once again, I want to emphasize for those people, as Evgeny put it rightly, here in London, for those people who are in London, that the levels of anxiety in Ukraine are enormous. I mean, they're really hitting the ceiling, and all people are looking. I mean, they're seeing the facts through their own prism. And it's very difficult for journalists who are not in the country to understand what is real and what is fake. I, from my personal experience, can tell you that you spend hours and hours to understand whether this fact is a fake or it is a reality. So, but unlike Dmitry thinks, I think that the modern technology does help us, because even a drawn-out mobile phone with the video in the middle of a crowd somewhere in Odessa and Lugansk, and you hear people discussing or accusing someone, and there is a hot discussion, hot debate going on, and you can see that there is a military passing by the road. This already gives you some kind of insight of what's happening in the country or what's happening in that part of the world. So modern technology does help, and even if it's an amateur journalism, even if it's somebody like a teenager with a mobile phone, it still gives you an idea, gives you a picture on the other side of the world, what's happening there in Ukraine. So it's all about internet and all about being careful with the facts you are reading and transmitting. Because now, even in the discussions, most of the time when we discuss something, we repeat somebody's thought or a news you've seen before on the internet. And before doing that, just think twice and think whether it's true or not.
Okay, well, we've overrun terribly. I apologise to the Frontline Club, but I guess it was inevitable, given this is a very hot topic. It's very much still ongoing, sadly. And it just remains for me to thank very much all our panellists, and especially those who made the journey from Kyiv to be with us here in London. And thank you all for coming and listening so attentively and giving us your comments.